Eleanor Winslow sat in the third pew from the back of St. Aldhelm's, listened to the curate read the banns of marriage between her husband and another woman, and did not move. She did not gasp. She did not reach for the pew rail. She did not turn to look at the front of the church, where the Duke of Alderley sat with his mother's satisfaction arranged on her face like a table laid for company that had finally, after 2 years of waiting, agreed to come. Her hand rose instead, unhurried, and pressed flat against her collarbone, where beneath wool and linen a plain gold ring hung from a length of ribbon, worn against the skin, because it had never once, in 2 years, been permitted to be worn anywhere it could be seen. She pressed it once. It answered her, small and hard and unmistakably real, and she let her hand fall back into her lap. I, Julian Robert Ashworth, Duke of Alderley, bachelor of this parish, the curate read, and the word bachelor went through the church like a dropped plate, heard by everyone and remarked upon by no one, because no one else in the pews knew it was a lie. By the third reading of those banns, 3 Sundays from this one, the Duke of Alderley would understand exactly what he had priced so cheaply. It would take her precisely that long to finish the accounting. She had never yet found 3 weeks insufficient for anything that mattered, and she did not intend to begin now. The summer of 1815 had come to the county of Hallamare the way it always came, dry at the edges and grudging in the middle, the hedgerows going gold before their time, and the tenants watching the sky the way men watch a creditor they cannot yet afford to pay. It was into that summer, 2 years before this Sunday, that the old Duke of Alderley had died, leaving behind a house, an entail, and £41,000 of debt accumulated across 3 decades of cards, horses, and a mistress in Bath, who had outlasted 2 of his physicians. Thomas Winslow had been the old Duke's land steward for 30 years by then, a plain, careful man who kept Alderley's books the way other men kept their consciences, and it was Thomas Winslow who sat the young new Duke down in the estate office with the ledgers open between them and explained, without softening a single figure, exactly how close the dukedom stood to the edge of a cliff with no rope at the bottom. It was Thomas Winslow, too, who made the proposal that no one in the county ever learned the whole of. His late wife's family had been in trade, mercers, prosperous, unfashionable, and solvent, and his daughter Eleanor had £15,000 of her mother's money settled on her, along with a head for figures that her father had trained since she was 9 years old, sitting beside him at the estate desk with her feet not yet reaching the floor. A marriage, private, conducted in the estate's old chapel by Mr. Simeon Drake, with no one present but the curate, Thomas Winslow, and the land agent Josiah Fenn as witnesses. The debts settled, the estate saved, and the new Duke free, in the eyes of the county and his mother's ambitions, to be introduced to society as an eligible man, because a wife kept privately was, in every practical sense that mattered to the Dowager Duchess, no wife at all. Julian Ashworth had agreed to it the way a drowning man agrees to a rope, gratefully, and without asking what it would cost the person holding the other end. For 2 years Eleanor had kept Alderley's books balanced to the shilling, while her husband maintained a bachelor's establishment in town, for the sake of his mother's pride and the county's ignorance. She oversaw the harvest accounts under her maiden initials. She corresponded with the wool factors. As E. Winslow, agent, she dined alone at the hall 4 nights out of 7, and on the nights Julian came down from town, they discussed rents and drainage across a table set, always, for 2 people who were not quite strangers, and had never once been anything more. She had told herself this was a fair exchange. She had told herself a great many things. News of the Fenwick courtship had reached her the way most things reached her, through the ledgers first. A new account had opened at the local bank in the name of Silas Fenwick, a mill owner from the northern edge of the county with more money than lineage, and a daughter, Priscilla, whom the Dowager Duchess had begun inviting to tea with a frequency that made the purpose plain to anyone who could read a pattern the way Eleanor could read a pattern. She had been summoned to church that morning for what Augusta Ashworth's note had called a small parish matter requiring your attendance. She had understood the whole of it only once she was seated, and by then there had been nothing to do but sit very still and listen to a stranger's voice announce, in the plainest legal language available to the Church of England, that her husband intended to marry someone else in 3 weeks' time. She had 3 weeks. She had never yet found 3 weeks insufficient for anything that mattered. The service ended the way services end, with a hymn nobody's heart was in, and a general shuffling toward the door, and Eleanor rose with the rest of the congregation, and did not weep, and did not stumble, and did not give the Dowager Duchess of Alderley the satisfaction of a single visible crack. She walked the length of the nave with her spine straight, and her gloved hands folded, and at the church door she paused, briefly, before the young couple receiving quiet congratulations they had not yet earned, and she said, because it cost her nothing to be gracious, and everything not to be, I wish you joy. Then she left. She did not go directly through the lich gate. She lingered a moment in its shadow to retie a bonnet ribbon that did not need retying, and it was there, unseen, that she heard her husband's voice on the other side of the yew hedge, low and meant for his mother alone. I did not marry her for love, mother, Julian was saying, in the flat, resigned tone of a man reciting a debt he had long since stopped disputing. I married her because the estate needed her. It still does. That is all this ever was, and you know it as well as I. The Dowager's reply was too quiet to carry. Eleanor did not wait to hear it. She stood by the lich gate with her watch in her gloved hand, and she gave herself 10 minutes. The same 10 minutes she had given herself the day her father died, and no more than that, because grief unrationed was a debt that compounded, and she had learned that lesson at her father's own desk before she was old enough to understand what it would cost her to keep it. When the 10 minutes were finished, she put the watch away. She did not go back to the hall. She turned instead down the mill road, toward the one place in Hallowmere that had never once needed reminding it was hers, and she walked the whole 3 miles without once looking back at the church. Josiah Fenn found her on the 2nd mile, driving the estate cart back from the sheep fair, and he did not ask her what had happened, because Josiah Fenn had been reading Eleanor Winslow's face since she was 9 years old, and had no need of the information twice. Heard the reading, he said, drawing the horse up beside her. Get in. I'm walking to the mill. I know where you're walking. Get in, and I'll walk you there faster. He held out a hand, weathered and steady, and after a moment she took it, and climbed up beside him. They rode in silence for a while, the cartwheels finding every rut Hallowmere had to offer, before he spoke again. Your father used to say a house is only as honest as its books. Reckon that goes for a man too. My father also used to say grief left unrationed compounds, like an unpaid note. Aye, he did. Josiah clicked his tongue at the horse. What are you owed at Ashcombe these days? Rent's unpaid since March. A wheel that hasn't turned since the frost. And a miller who thinks a woman's signature isn't worth the ink. She looked ahead, at the low roofline of the mill just visible over the next rise, the one asset in all of Hallowmere that carried her mother's name instead of anyone's title. I find I have 3 weeks, Josiah, and nowhere better to spend the first of them. Ashcombe Mill had not turned a profit in 3 years, and it had not turned its wheel at all in 4 months, and both facts were written plainly in a ledger so poorly kept that Eleanor had to read 3 years of entries twice before she trusted her own arithmetic. £211 owed to the corn factor, 6 weeks of unpaid wages to the 4 men who still, out of habit more than hope, came each morning to a mill that had nothing for them to do. A miller, Hob Carrow, who met her at the gate with his hat still on his head and his opinion of women who read ledgers written plainly across his face. "Begging pardon, ma'am," he said, in the tone of a man who was not, in fact, begging any pardon at all. "But I've had solicitors down from the county who couldn't make sense of these books. I don't see what good it does, a lady turning pages at them." "Then we shall find out together, Mr. Carrow." She did not raise her voice. She set the ledger on the mill's own counter, opened it to March, and turned it so he could see the page as well as she could. "You've entered the corn factor's payment twice, in April, and not at all in May. Which do you believe actually happened?" He looked. He looked longer than he meant to. "May," he admitted slowly. "I never had the coin to pay him in May." "Then May is where your wheel stopped turning, not April, and the difference between those 2 months is £40 you have been chasing in the wrong direction for 4 weeks. She took up his pen, the mill's pen, cheap and much mended, and began, line by line, to walk the accounts back from the beginning out loud, so that he could follow every step of it. It took the better part of 2 days. By the end of them, Hob Carrow was bringing her tea unasked, in a cup that did not match its saucer, and by the end of the week the corn factor had been paid what he was truly owed, no more and no less, and the 4 idle men had wages in their pockets for the first time since March. Word of it moved through the village the way water moves downhill, finding every low place first. The smith heard it from Carrow's wife. The vicar heard it from the smith. And within a fortnight there was scarcely a soul in Hallowmere who had not heard some version of the tale of the lady who had made Ashcombe's wheel turn again, with nothing but a pen and an unwillingness to be told no. A letter arrived from Alderley's man of business during that same week, forwarded by Josiah without comment, referencing in dry legal language certain irregularities discovered in the original documentation of the parish marriage of 1813, presently under review at the instruction of the Dowager Duchess. Eleanor read it once, filed it in the same drawer of her writing desk where she kept every other paper that mattered, and did not permit herself a second reading. There would be time enough for that letter later. It was. She noted with the same flat attention she gave a column of figures that did not balance. The first paper weapon anyone had troubled to aim at her directly. And a weapon aimed was a weapon that could, eventually, be traced back to the hand that had thrown it. The mill's wheel turned again by the last week of the month, groaning at first and then steady, and the sound of it carried clear across the water meadow. 3 days after that, the Duke of Alderley came to see it turn. He came on estate business, or said he did, a question about the mill's lease that any competent clerk could have settled by letter, and he stood a long while at the edge of the mill pond, watching the wheel take the water and lift it and let it fall, watching Hob Carrow touch his hat to Eleanor Winslow with something that had not been there a month before, watching his wife move through a working building the way she had never once been permitted to move through his own drawing-room, as though it belonged to her because she had made it worth belonging to. He did not smile. Julian Ashworth had trained himself, over some 29 years, entirely out of the habit of smiling where it might be observed and misread as an opening. But something in his jaw eased, fractionally, watching her, and Josiah Fenn, who missed nothing, noted it and said nothing, and filed it away the same as Eleanor filed her letters. "You've done well here," Julian said, when she finally came to where he stood. "I have done what the numbers required," she said. "It is rarely more complicated than that, Your Grace." She had not called him anything else in 2 years, and she did not intend to begin softening it now, 3 Sundays before another woman's banns finished ringing in the same church that had witnessed her own vows. He flinched at the title, very slightly, and she noted that too, and filed it, and said nothing further, because there was nothing further that would not cost her more than it was worth to say. It was Josiah who brought her the second paper, a week later, the one concerning her father. "There's talk," he said, setting a folded letter on the mill counter between them without preamble, "that Thomas Winslow died owing Alderley money. £2,000, some say. Others say more. Eleanor did not touch the letter at once. My father's books were exact to the farthing the day he died. I closed them myself. I know that. You know that. Half the county's now hearing otherwise, and hearing it from a mouth close enough to the hall that it carries weight. Josiah's face was as flat and unreadable as a fence post, which was, for Josiah, an expression of considerable feeling. Someone wants your name muddied before your husband's wedding day, Eleanor. Can't think why that might be." They went through her father's ledgers together across 3 long evenings at the mill's kitchen table, the same ledgers she had kept since she was old enough to hold a pen steady, and they found, as she had known they would find, that every entry balanced, every debt was accounted, every payment recorded twice over in her father's meticulous hand. What they found beyond that was worse, and better, a set of payments in the old Duke's own hand, made across 4 years to an address in Bath that matched no tenant, no factor, no legitimate expense of the estate, the very money the Whisper campaign now tried to lay at her father's grave. Buried in the same batch of old papers, tucked behind a rent roll from 1811, was a single sheet in a clerk's careful copy hand, noting the date of Mr. Simeon Drake's ordination and the licence under which he had been permitted to perform marriages in the parish, a date that, if read carelessly, or altered by a single stroke, might be made to look as though it fell after, rather than before, the summer of Eleanor's own wedding. She looked at that sheet for a long time. "Your father used to say a ledger does not lie," Josiah said quietly, watching her. "Didn't say it can't be made to look like it's lying, if someone gets there first with a knife and enough patience." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He did not say that. But he would have known it was true. It was that same week that she learned, from Josiah, the shape of the wound she had lived 2 years beside, without ever being permitted to touch it. Julian's father had not merely gambled the estate to its knees, he had spent the better part of Julian's boyhood absent from it entirely, wintering in Bath with his mistress, while his wife raised a son alone, in a house too large for the both of them, and had died, at the end, with the mistress's name on his lips, and his own wife and heir informed of it by letter. Augusta Ashworth had raised her son on a single doctrine since that day, repeated so often it had worn a groove in him the way water wears a groove in stone. That sentiment was the mechanism by which men like his father ruined estates like Alderley, and that duty, cold and reliable, was the only inheritance worth keeping intact. "He isn't cruel," Josiah said. "Never known him cruel a day in his life. He's just been told, since he was 7 years old, that the alternative to being cold is being his father. A boy raised on that choice generally picks cold, and generally goes on picking it long after he's grown enough to know better. The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of Eleanor Winslow the way a tide speaks of a shore it is slowly reclaiming. Quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. The mill's turning wheel, her father's cleared name, which Josiah made certain reached the right ears at the right pace. The 4 families at Ashcombe now paid fairly and on time. It was not yet enough to stop a wedding. But it was, Eleanor thought, precisely the shape of thing that made a county start asking the questions its betters would rather it did not ask. A letter came on a Thursday, in a careful, unhappy hand Eleanor did not recognise at first, asking whether Miss Priscilla Fenwick might call upon her, in confidence, before the week was out. Priscilla Fenwick came to the mill alone, on foot, in a plain grey pelisse chosen. Eleanor understood at once, precisely so as not to be recognised on the road, and she stood in the mill's small office, wringing her gloves in both hands before she managed to say what she had come to say. "I do not know what is true," Priscilla said, "and I have decided I would rather be told plainly than continue being managed kindly. My father says there is talk of irregularities in a document somewhere. The Dowager Duchess says it is nothing, a technicality, already resolved. You do not look, Mrs. Winslow, like a woman troubled by a technicality." "I am not Mrs. Winslow," Eleanor said. "I am the Duchess of Alderley, and have been for 2 years, and no one has yet shown me a single lawful paper that makes that untrue." She watched the colour leave Priscilla Fenwick's face, and did not enjoy watching it. "I did not ask you here to ruin you, Miss Fenwick. You have done nothing that deserves ruin. I asked because I would rather you heard the truth from the woman it belongs to than from the woman who has been using you to obtain a mill owner's fortune for an estate that is, in point of fact, no longer short of one." Priscilla sat down, rather suddenly, in the office's one good chair. "He does not love me," she said, after a moment, with the flat relief of someone setting down a weight she had been carrying without permission to name it. "I have known that for some time. I told myself it did not signify." "It signifies a great deal," Eleanor said. "I would know." Priscilla left an hour later, considerably paler and considerably steadier, having agreed to say nothing to her father yet, and to delay, on some plausible pretext of her own devising, whatever preparations remained to be delayed. It was not a triumph. It was not meant to be. It was, Eleanor thought, watching her walk back down the mill road, the first stone set correctly in a wall that would need a great many more before it could hold anything up. It was 2 days after that Julian came to the mill in the early evening and asked, for the first time in 2 years, to be let into a room in his own house that had stood locked since his father's death. He found her already there, in fact, in the small estate office at the hall rather than the mill, going through old rent rolls by candlelight, and he stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "The muniment room," he said. "My father locked it the year before he died, and never gave anyone the key. I have never opened it. I think," he stopped, started again. "I think you should be the one to open it with me." They went together, that same hour, down a corridor Eleanor had walked 100 times without ever once seeing this particular door give way. And the key, an old iron thing Josiah had kept, unasked, in a drawer for 2 years, against exactly this eventuality, turned with a groan that sounded, to Eleanor, uncannily like a held breath finally released. Inside, among account books and old surveys and a decade of unopened correspondence, they found what she had already half suspected they would find: a draft, in the Dowager's own hand, of the very letter that had gone to Alderley's man of business, alleging irregularities in Mr. Drake's licence. A draft with 2 words crossed through and rewritten, the true date scored out, and a false one entered in its place, practice enough to make certain the final copy carried no such telltale correction. Julian read it twice. His face, when he lifted it, was the face of a man doing arithmetic he very much disliked and could no longer avoid. "She has been building this since before the banns were ever read," he said quietly. "Since before you ever agreed to have them read," Eleanor said. She did not soften it. She had rationed her softness carefully for 2 years, and did not intend to spend the whole of it in a single evening. He was silent for a long moment, standing amid his father's locked papers with his mother's forgery in his hand. "I told her," he said finally, "when she first proposed this, Priscilla, the licence, all of it, that the estate had already been saved once. I told her I did not see why it needed saving twice. And yet you let the banns be read." Yes. He did not look away from her when he said it, which she noted, and filed, and did not yet forgive. "I told myself it would be kinder to you to make it quiet. A settlement. No scandal. I have spent 2 years telling myself a great many things were kindness, that were, in fact, only cowardice wearing kindness's coat." She crossed the room and took the ribbon from beneath her collar, working the knot loose with steady fingers until the plain gold ring came free into her palm. She held it out to him. "Keep it," she said, "until you can tell me why it was ever hidden instead of announced. I am not interested in apologies tonight, Your Grace. I have had 2 years of explanations that cost you nothing. Show me. Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, or do not trouble to show me at all." He said nothing. He closed his hand around the ring, slowly, as though it might refuse to fit there, and she left him standing in the room his father had locked, holding the one object in it that had ever been entirely honest. The 11 days that followed moved the way the last stretch of any long road moves, faster than the rest, and somehow slower too. And Eleanor spent every one of them assembling paper, the way a mason assembles stone, methodically, and with an eye always on the weight the whole structure would eventually have to bear. She and Josiah drove out to the neighbouring parish of Whitmarsh, where the retired curate, Simeon Drake, now lived in a cottage with a bad hip and a memory considerably sharper than his knees. He remembered the wedding well, a quiet Tuesday, he said, in the estate chapel, the Duke solemn as a churchyard, and the bride steadier than any bride he had ever married. He remembered, too, and confirmed in his own careful hand for the record, that his licence to perform marriages in the parish had been granted a full 18 months before that Tuesday, not after it, whatever any altered copy might now claim. Mr. Abel Coates, a solicitor from the county town with a reputation for incorruptibility that made him widely disliked and universally trusted, examined the original entry in the register kept, by long custom of the parish, in duplicate at St. Aldhelm's, one copy at the Hall, which had been tampered with, and one copy lodged as the law required with the diocesan registry, which had not. "The marriage is valid," Coates said, closing the register with the flat satisfaction of a man who preferred facts to opinions. It was valid the day it was solemnised, and no letter, forged or otherwise, changes an entry that was never in the forger's keeping to begin with. The dowager's counterstroke came 4 days before the wedding, in the form of an affidavit, sworn, notarized, entirely fabricated, suggesting that Eleanor Winslow had bribed Mr. Drake to alter his memory of events, and that the true irregularity lay not in the dowager's letter, but in the desperate scheming of a steward's daughter, unwilling to relinquish a title she had never rightfully held. Eleanor read it once, in Josiah's presence, at the Mills kitchen table. "She is not a stupid woman," Eleanor said, folding the affidavit and setting it, without any particular heat, atop the growing stack of papers in her document case. "She has simply mistaken paper for a weapon that cannot be turned back on the hand that throws it. That is the one mistake, I find, that this family seems determined to make twice." The wedding was fixed now for the Saturday following Michaelmas. Eleanor had, by her own count, 11 days, and then 7, and then none at all. Staint. Aldhelms had never held so full a congregation, not for a christening, not for a harvest thanksgiving, not even for the old Duke's funeral, and every pew was packed shoulder to shoulder with the county's better families and the county's working families both, because word of what had passed at Ashcombe Mill and in the muniment room and at Whitmarsh had travelled, in the way such things travel, faster than any of the principals had quite intended it to. Julian stood at the front in his wedding clothes, with a face like a man walking to a reckoning he had, at last, decided he deserved. Priscilla Fenwick stood beside her father near the door rather than at the altar rail, in a plain mourning dress rather than bridal white, which several of the assembled company noted, and none of them yet understood. The Dowager Duchess sat in the first pew, with her chin at its accustomed angle, serene as poured cream, and utterly unaware that the cream had already begun, quietly to turn. The rector reached the moment the law required him to reach, the moment every soul in that church had heard 100 times and never once expected to matter, if any of you know cause, or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony. Ye are to declare it. Eleanor Winslow rose from the third pew from the back. She did not shout. She did not weep. She walked the length of the nave with the same steady step that had carried her out of this same church 3 weeks before, and this time she did not stop at the door. "I know cause," she said, and her voice carried, plain and unhurried, to the very back wall. "This man is already married. He has been married for 2 years to me by Mr. Kepfer, Simeon Drake, in the chapel at Alderley, and the record of it is lodged, correctly and lawfully, in the diocesan registry at Whitmarsh, where any person in this room is welcome to examine it." The turning of that room was a thing Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, and so would every soul who witnessed it, the way 300 people's certainty shifted at once, the way breath moved through the pews like wind through standing corn, the way the Dowager Duchess's serenity cracked first at the eyes, and then, more slowly and more completely, at the mouth. "This is precisely the fabrication I warned you of," Augusta said, rising, her voice pitched to carry as far as Eleanor's had. "She has coerced a doddering old curate and forged a register entry. And I have a sworn affidavit, you have a sworn affidavit," Eleanor agreed, "which Mr. Abel Coates here will confirm was notarized 4 days ago at your own instruction, and which conveniently omits any mention of the letter in your own hand, found in the muniment room your late husband locked, in which the true date of Mr. Drake's ordination is crossed through, and a false one entered above it." Abel Coates stepped forward from the second pew, register in hand, and confirmed it, in the flat, procedural voice of a man who dealt only in what could be proven. Simeon Drake, brought that morning by cart despite his hip, rose unbidden from a back pew to say, in his own creaking voice, that he had performed one marriage in that chapel in the summer of 1813, and had never in 50 years of ministry been paid a shilling to remember it any way but truly. Josiah Fenn stood and said, plainly, that he had witnessed the vows himself, and would swear to it before any magistrate in the county. Hob Carrow, uninvited and still in his work clothes, stood at the very back and said that whatever the fine folk wished to call her, the lady who had put Ashcombe's wheel back in motion, was no forger, and he'd stake his own name on it before God and the parish both. Silas Fenwick rose next, his face grey, and took his daughter's arm. "I believe," he said heavily, "we have been imposed upon, and I will not have my daughter's name attached to a marriage built on another woman's forged paper. Priscilla, we are leaving." Priscilla went with him without protest, and at the door she paused only long enough to meet Eleanor's eyes, not with resentment, but with something closer to gratitude, before she was gone. The Dowager Duchess of Alderley stood alone, at last, in a church that had finished turning against her, and something behind her composure went out like a snuffed candle. Eleanor could have finished her there. She understood, standing in the nave with 300 witnesses and an unbroken chain of paper in her document case, that she held every card required to see Augusta Ashworth removed from Alderley entirely, her name ruined past repair, her dower rights contested to nothing. She considered it, briefly and honestly, the way she considered any figure that did not yet balance. "I will not press for your removal," Eleanor said instead, quietly enough that only the front pews caught it clearly, though the silence carried her words regardless. "You will retire to the Dower House, and you will retract, in writing before this same rector, every word you have said against my father's name and mine. That is the whole of what I require. I could ask for a great deal more. I find I would rather not spend the rest of my life collecting on it." It was not forgiveness. Eleanor was careful, even then, to know the difference. It was mercy, dispensed from a position of undeniable power, and it cost her something to give it, and she gave it anyway, because her father had taught her that a ledger closed in anger was rarely closed correctly. The county recalibrated. That Saturday, the way a tide turns, not all at once, but completely, and past any possibility of turning back. Julian found her that evening in the estate office, where she had gone out of long habit to see the day's business properly filed before she permitted herself to feel any of it. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and I understand now that it is not the same thing as an apology, and that you will require both of me before you require anything else." "Then begin," she said with the explanation, "since it is the harder of the two." He told her, standing in the room that had been the site of every important reckoning in his life, of a boy who had watched his father leave for months at a time and return smelling of somewhere else, of a mother who had told him, over and over, that warmth was the mechanism by which men like his father ruined everything they touched, of a young duke who had married a capable woman gratefully, and then spent 2 years too frightened of his own inheritance to admit that gratitude had, somewhere in the 2nd year, become something considerably larger and more dangerous than gratitude. "I told my mother I married you because the estate needed you," he said. It was true. It was never the whole truth, and I did not have the courage to say the rest of it until I very nearly lost the chance to say it at all. "That is the explanation," Eleanor said. "I am still waiting for the apology." "I am sorry," he said plainly, without ornament, "that I let you be invisible for 2 years to spare myself a scandal I told myself was your comfort. I am sorry I let bans be read for another woman before I found the courage to defend the marriage I already had. I am sorry it took a church full of witnesses to make me say, aloud, what I ought to have said to you privately a year ago." "All right," Eleanor said. All right then, and that, for the moment, was the whole of the treaty. She itemised her terms the way she itemised every account that mattered, plainly in order, with nothing left implied. Her name would be used, publicly and permanently, as Duchess of Alderley, in every register, every invitation, every account book from that day forward. Her authority over the estate's accounts would be formalised in writing, not merely tolerated in practice. Ashcombe Mill would remain hers alone, entailed to no one, answerable to no one but herself. And there would be no more hiding, not of documents, not of decisions, not of him. "Agreed," he said, in every particular. "Agreed," she said, and something in the room. Some long-held breath the house itself seemed to have been holding since his father's death, finally let go. Augusta Ashworth's single apology came 3 days later, in the estate office, before Eleanor alone, and it was brief, and it cost the Dowager Duchess more than any speech she had given in 30 years of giving them. "I called you useful," Augusta said, standing very straight, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed white. "I never once called you anything else. In 2 years, not even to myself. I told myself that was safety. I have come to understand it was only cruelty, practised so long I had stopped noticing the difference." She did not ask forgiveness. Eleanor did not offer it. She offered, instead, tea and a chair, and the plain fact that the retraction had already been read before the parish and needed no repeating. "All right," Eleanor said. "All right," Augusta echoed, and sat. The weeks that followed were built, as Eleanor had built everything that had ever mattered to her, in small units rather than grand gestures. A chair moved, without comment, to sit beside hers at breakfast rather than across from it. A ledger left open between them in the evenings, his hand and hers both making entries in the same margin. Tea poured for her before she had asked for it, exactly the way she took it, because he had finally troubled himself to learn how she took it. None of it, the narration of her own life reminded her privately, meant anything in isolation. All of it, taken together, meant everything. There was one relapse. 3 weeks into the new arrangement, a tenant came to Julian directly with a request to have a cottage roof repaired before winter, and Julian, out of 2 years' habit of deciding such things alone, agreed to it and had the work begun without a word to her. She found out from the estate carpenter, not from him, and she named it to him that same evening, calmly, across the shared ledger. "You did not consult me," she said, "not because the decision was wrong. Because the habit of deciding without me is the very habit we agreed to break." He was quiet a moment. "You are right," he said. "It will not happen again," and the following month, when a similar request came, he brought it to her first, and watched her decide it, and said nothing at all about how strange it still felt to him to share a decision rather than simply make one. It was on an ordinary evening some months later, with no occasion attached to it beyond the ledger being closed for the night, that he said the thing she had been waiting 2 years to hear him find the courage to finish. "I told my mother once that I married you because the estate needed you," he said. That was true. It was never the whole truth. I did not have the courage then to say the rest, which is that I need you, entire, apart from any ledger and any acre this family has ever owned. I did not marry the woman the estate needed. I have fallen in love, some years too late, with the woman I married. "I would choose you," she said in return, because the bare 3 words had never once, in her father's house or her own heart, seemed sufficient to the weight of the thing. I have been choosing you, in point of fact, since the day I rose from that pew, and did not even give you the satisfaction of a scene. She wept that autumn, at her father's grave, for the first time without counting the minutes, and it was not a failure of her composure. It was, she understood, standing at the headstone with Julian's hand steady at her back, the first time in years she had trusted anyone enough to let grief run its whole natural course without rationing it first. 2 years passed the way years pass when a house has finally stopped holding its breath. Priscilla Fenwick married the following spring. A naval captain of good humour and no fortune whatsoever, for reasons her father grumbled about and privately understood completely. Augusta Ashworth lived out her days in the Dower House, having funded, at Eleanor's quiet suggestion and her own considerable expense, a village school at Marlingford that bore no family name at all, which was, everyone agreed, the closest thing to true penance the old dowager had in her. Josiah Fenn became Alderley's land agent in full, a title he wore the way he wore everything, without any particular ceremony. Ashcombe Mill turned a profit for the 4th consecutive year, its wages posted openly on the mill door for any man to check against the books himself, because Eleanor Winslow had learned early that the surest proof of an honest house was a ledger no one need ever ask to see. The ring that had once hung hidden beneath a ribbon and a collar sat now, every day, on Eleanor's hand at the head of the Alderley table, in plain view of tenants and county alike, and no one in Hallamare any longer required an explanation for why it was there. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee, not because she had shouted louder than the room, but because she had kept better accounts of her own worth than anyone else had troubled to keep. And in the end the ledger does not lie, and neither, when it mattered most, had she. That was not a debt anyone could ever again forge their way out of paying, and a house that had once held its breath for 2 years, waiting to see whether it would be loved or merely used, had finally, unmistakably, begun to breathe.